first question that we have is, how did you become aware of Freedom House, and what struck you about this story when you first encountered it?
In 2016, I published a book about my time as a paramedic called 1,000 Naked Strangers, and somebody who read it years later, so this is, I guess, in 2018, sent me an email and said, "Hey, I read your story. It was interesting, but do you know the story? Do you know the backstory? Do you know how all this began? Have you ever heard of Freedom House?" And I had not. And so I started researching it, and I kept thinking at any moment I was going to uncover the definitive, Jill Lepore, New Yorker, 10,000 word story. And I never found one. And having been a paramedic, I worked on an ambulance for 10 years. It was a definitive period of my life. I kind of took it personally that this incredible piece of history had been swept under the rug. And so I couldn't let it go, and I started digging into it, and immediately realized, oh wow, there's not only an incredible story, but it's driven by these incredible people. And if you're a storyteller of any type, those are the two magic ingredients that just set you on fire.
Awesome. So about Freedom House, what was the problem that Freedom House's EMS service was trying to solve, both in terms of lack of options for medical transport in general, and the problems associated with the role that police played in that realm?
So in the mid-1960s, which is when Freedom House is born, and this is nationwide, the problem that exists is that if you have a medical emergency, there are three people or three different options that will show up to your house to respond to your emergency. One is two police officers, one is two volunteer firefighters, and one is two undertakers in a hearse. And none of these options provide any kind of medical care, certainly no legitimate medical care. It's essentially just a ride to the hospital. And so by 65, medical authorities and governmental authorities are beginning to say, hey, we have this unchecked epidemic of traumatic deaths in the United States that are preventable. And the cause of it is a complete lack of pre-hospital medical care. Somebody needs to do something. Now, nobody knew what something was. And frankly, no one had a good idea of who somebody was. That it was a problem without a solution, almost a problem that didn't know how to ask itself what it was. And so, that's kind of what's happening from a larger sense. In a lot of communities where the police were responding, this is the 1960s. It's, certainly no secret that it was an era of a lot of tension, particularly in black communities. And so in places like the Hill District of Pittsburgh, where Freedom House was born, if they had a medical emergency, they had to rely on the police. And this was an organization that had a very bad reputation in that neighborhood. The relationship between residents and cops was acrimonious at best. There are a number of stories of either police not showing up to a call or showing up and then determining that the person was not worthy of care. Either they thought, well, this guy's drunk, or this person can deal with it on their own. We're not going to bother with it. There's one story of a guy who later became a Freedom House paramedic whose mother had a stroke. And when he called for help, the police insisted that she was drunk. And he kept trying to explain that she didn't drink and she wasn't drunk and that something was seriously wrong. They finally agreed to take her to the hospital, but refused to carry her. So he had to carry his own mother out to the police wagon and set her in the back. And that was the last time he saw her alive, because they assumed she was drunk. She got parked in a hallway. She was having a stroke. It was never treated, or certainly not treated quickly enough, and she wound up dying because of that. So those were the stakes in 1965 before Freedom House starts.
In that sort of context, right, we have Freedom House, Freedom House's EMS service, and their paramedics. What sort of innovation or what did they bring to the issue of sort of pre-hospitalization medical care that you described?
In terms of innovation, it's kind of like the birth of the iPhone or the invention of the internet. You go from nothing to everything, sort of one moment, one day. So imagine Freedom House begins operating on an ambulance in April of 1968, in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So the day before they hit the streets, if you have a medical emergency, what's going to arrive is two aging police officers with no training and no equipment who are going to put you in the back and let you ride alone to the hospital, where if you deteriorate, you will not only ride alone, but die alone. On April 6, 1968, when they step into the streets and begin running calls for the first time, you have two trained professionals who can treat a seizure, a heart attack, a stroke, a hemorrhage. They can deliver babies. They can deliver shocks in case of cardiac arrest. They can do CPR. They have the full spectrum of drugs that emergency medicine mandates today. Everything that a paramedic today can do, they can do in 1968. So, I mean, to say this is a quantum leap in medicine, honestly, is an understatement. I mean, you go quite literally from nothing to everything all at once. So, you know, that alone is a massive innovation. But that isn't where it stops. The ambulance gets redesigned. Up until that point, you know, it's some sort of a truck, it's a hearse. Well, the ambulance gets redesigned. The paint scheme gets they decide, okay, well, what's the most visible paint color? And so they come up with this orange and white scheme, which if you looked at ambulances into the early 1990s, they were pretty much all orange and white. The design of the interior of the ambulance. So if you're ever in an ambulance, you'll notice at the head of the stretcher, there's a seat, and that's called the captain's chair. And the reason for that seat is so that a paramedic can control a patient's airway. There's wall-mounted suction in the ambulance. That is a Freedom House innovation. The dimensions of the interior of the ambulance, this is all sort of something that was conceived in the head of Peter Saffer, who was the guy who wrote the paramedic curriculum, and improved upon over time through feedback he was getting from the paramedics in the street. So I mean, it's almost impossible to say how many things came from these guys, because essentially it's everything. You know, all the way up to the first people to give Narcan in the street to reverse a heroin overdose are Freedom House paramedics. I mean, time and again, they're at the forefront of this medical revolution that is pre-hospital medicine.
You know, I think it is a point that bears incredible emphasis, that, you know, you in your role as a medic at EMS for 10 years, right, in 2023 or 2010 or whatever, are really working with tools that were developed in an underserved, underprivileged, racialized Black community in the mid-1960s, in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King, right? You know, I wanted to ask, to what extent can you imagine yourself, right, or given your knowledge of contemporary EMS practices, you know, all the things. I think it is worth sort of going through the list of all the things that we can rely upon today in terms of calling 911 during a medical emergency, that we can say it's this community, this Black community in Pittsburgh that provided that for us. So you mentioned Narcan and heroin overdoses, the placement of a medic at the head of a person being transported so that their airway is sort of clear. Can you describe? Sorry, you mentioned it. The suction on the side of the EMS walls, the color of ambulances, and so on. What exactly? I think we all, you know, to do justice to what these folks developed, it would be nice to say, to enumerate almost everything if we have time on the podcast to do so.
Yeah. So if you're sitting down at the head of a stretcher and you are the paramedic with a patient, a critical patient, to your right there is this canister with a suction unit that is powered through the ambulance's manifold. And what that does is that allows you, should that person regurgitate, should that person have any sort of secretions in the airway, which are deadly. You know, there's this old maxim, without an airway, you don't have a patient. Those things are right there so that you can immediately treat a patient. That is a Freedom House innovation. You know, the development of a stair chair. So if you have a patient on the second floor or a third floor or a sixth floor and you don't have an elevator, or your stretcher will not fit in an elevator, which is often the case even today, there are elevators that are tiny. You have this sort of wheeled chair that can bring people down. That was a thing that they pioneered as well. The air cast is, you know, sort of a very quick way to stabilize a fracture in the field. That is an item that they helped to pioneer. Just the existence of a medical director. So, you know, up until World War II, doctors are heavily involved in EMS, even if they're not necessarily on the ambulance. The ambulances are run out of hospitals. So World War II, however, is such a massive undertaking that hospitals, because there's just not enough equipment and people left over in the civilian world, hospitals have to jettison their ambulance services. And so that's how they wind up with volunteer fire departments. That's how they wind up in funeral homes and police departments and with these civil defense forces. And so it goes away from medicine and becomes this, this sort of hybrid version of public safety, but not a medical version. And so it is simply a ride. And so Freedom House reintroduces the physician into this process by creating a medical director, which is a doctor that oversees the day-to-day operations of an ambulance service and makes sure that the medicine they're providing is up to date and is the correct medicine. And today you will not find an ambulance service in the nation that does not have a medical director at its helm. And in fact, if you look at every person who's been a paramedic in America, and it's a new field. Most cities did not have one before the early 1970s, in some cases slightly even later than that. All of those medics who have come in have nearly, the number is purely anecdotally, I will say it's north of 70%, have trained on a book called Emergency Care in the Streets. That book was written by Nancy Caroline, who was the Freedom House medical director, and she wrote that during calls or with the experience that she gained from riding on a Freedom House ambulance. So the literal training manual that if you talk to any older paramedic, I'm not sure what the politest word to say is for somebody who's in their 50s and 60s and perhaps no longer on an ambulance, if you talk to anyone who has been in this field for any period of time, they will tell you Emergency Care in the Streets is not only the book I learned on, but it's something like they try to find early copies of this because it is the Bible of paramedicine. This is a highly sought after text, and it's difficult to find. Early editions are very expensive and very rare. That is a book that people like John Moon and Mitch Brown and Walt Brown and Bill Rainovich and George McCary, they were on ambulances. They were running calls when nobody else was running calls, when the word paramedic did not exist, when the nation did not realize that you needed to treat people immediately or that you could treat people effectively immediately where they fell. They were out there. They were doing it. And they were quite literally writing the textbook that generations of people, myself included, and I did not enter this field until 2003, were trained on. So, their legacy, their literal footprint extends to this present day.
Can you describe a little bit some of these characters that you kind of encountered in your research and as you were writing the book, little bits of their biography that really maybe stuck out to you as someone actually serving in this sort of field? Who are these people? Where do they come from? And what did they overcome to sort of bring this thing to fruition?
Not surprisingly, these guys are colorful and eccentric because, who is going to sign up for a 9-month training program that pays very little for a job that does not exist, right? This is not, you are, by definition, you are sort of looking for people who either operate on the margins or are willing to take great risks. So, John Moon is this guy who's born in Atlanta, in a neighborhood called Buttermilk Bottom, which in the mid-1950s had neither running water nor electricity. His mother died when he was very young. His father had no choice but to give he and his sister up for adoption, or rather to an orphanage. They spent several years in an orphanage and were adopted by distant relatives in Pittsburgh about 5 years later. And that's what brought them to Pittsburgh. This was a kid who went to school every day in the same outfit and determined, by the 8th grade, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to make money, and every day I'm going to wear a different set of clothes, and I will never wear the same thing twice. So he would buy these flashy, Agora sweaters and gold lame jackets and crazy shoes and just go walking up and down the street because this was his way to tell the world, hey, look what I am. But as the 60s wear on, he starts to grow an afro, and he gets a daishiki, and he begins to identify that sort of that rebelliousness that he used to be able to display through flashy clothes, he begins to display through political clothes. And it is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It is his first experience in the working world and realizing, oh, wait a minute, despite the advances we've made in the 60s, I'm still stuck. Well, to hell with that, I'm not going to be stuck. I'm going to fight for it. And he isn't sure where he's going to find his way to fight for it until one night he's in a hospital working as an orderly, which is not exactly the most exciting of jobs. And he sees two young black men who look very much like him, come rushing through the door with a critical patient. and everybody sort of turns and follows them, and he watches these guys who look just like him, and he's stuck doing very, very menial work, and these guys are saving a life, and he catches this patch on their arm that says Freedom House and this patch on the other arm that says paramedic. He doesn't know what any of those words mean, but he knows how people look at these two guys, and he says, okay, I'm going to follow them. I'm going to become that. And he does, and it defines his life from that moment on. There's a guy by the name of George McCary who, sort of a self-described hustler who just has this big, gregarious personality, a big guy, huge smile, knows everybody. People who worked with him would describe him as the mayor of the Hill District. And he had graduated from high school and was just sort of having a good time hanging out. He had a bunch of girlfriends. He was living with his grandmother. And one day his grandmother came home, and there were some girls in the house that she didn't recognize, and she tried to kick him out. And he, he did what he could to not be evicted from his house. And she said, well, if you do something with your life, I'll let you stay here. And so he heard about this training course, and he decided to take the Freedom House training course. Didn't care about medicine, had no interest in medicine. However, he wanted to prove to his grandmother that he was more than just, some young kid with a big mouth. And goes through the program and immediately recognizes in this job a way to, to truly affect lives, to make a difference. And almost overnight, he flips a switch and becomes this dedicated provider. This guy by the name of Mitchell Brown, he was the one whose mother died. He was going to go to school. He goes to Detroit, go to university, Wayne State, and then decides instead to join the military. He goes to Vietnam, comes back, and is kind of trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life. And he hears about this ambulance program in his own neighborhood, headed by this guy named Peter Safar, who's the father of CPR, whose books Brown had studied when he was in Vietnam. And so he walks into the Freedom House headquarters, where Peter Safar is this very renowned, very imposing and intimidating physician. And Mitch Brown, who's young, has no experience other than having been in the Army, walks right up to Peter Safar and says, if you don't hire me, it's the biggest mistake you've ever made, because I'm better than anybody you have here. And so Safar says fine, takes him down into the ER and sort of forces him to show that he knows what he's doing, which he does. And he goes on to have a brilliant career, and then goes after that to have a long political career. There's a guy by the name of Bill Rainovich, who's sort of he's funny. In the upside-down world of Freedom House, he's the token white guy. So in the early 1970s, a ton of veterans are coming home from Vietnam. Nixon is sort of thrashing about for a way to employ these guys, and so he creates this program in which if you hire a veteran, you can get federal money. So up until that moment, Freedom House is by design a black-only organization. And Peter Safar hears about this way to get federal dollars, because Freedom House was very strapped for cash. By that point, the mayor had cut its operating budget in half. And so he walked up to Mitch Brown, who was then the director of operations, and he said, I think we need to hire white people. And Mitch said, no, we don't need any white people. And Safar said, well, if we do, we can get a federal grant. And Mitch said, all right, let's go hire some white people. So that's how Bill Rainovich gets in. He had been in the Marines. He had been the only white guy in his platoon in the Marines, and so when he arrived at Freedom House, he instantly recognized what his role was, which was, he was the guy who's bringing in federal dollars, and he figured, if I can do this job and I care for the patients as much as these guys will care for the patients, they'll immediately forget that I'm white. And so he just threw himself into it, and everybody who worked with him and around him, accepted him and loved him just like they did everybody else. So it is this organization that drew people in from all over the place. I mean, their sort of most famous medical director, Nancy Caroline, was a wildly intelligent young Jewish woman from Boston who had no experience with, certainly none in Pittsburgh, and frankly, very little, if any, experience in the black community when she accepted this job. She'd never heard of a paramedic. She'd never been on an ambulance. She gets thrust into this position of being their medical director without knowing who they are or what they could possibly need from her. And because she's such a driven perfectionist, she just sort of lets go of all other elements of her life, puts a cot in the crew room, sleeps in there with them, runs calls with them, does everything that no other physician up to that point has done, and forges a very tight bond with these guys that last through the end of her life. You know, when I was going through her archives, I found cards that they had sent her decades later saying, hey, here's a picture of my son. He's 13 now. Can you believe it? So it was from top to bottom, it is an organization of people who were looking for something. And in most cases, it was a way to prove themselves to a skeptical world. They were well aware of what they were capable of. It was just the rest of us who had not yet accepted it. And, you know, through this sort of wonderful accidental moment in history, the place that they had to prove themselves was in the back of an ambulance.
Well, that's fantastic. So, in the course of your response, you mentioned that Freedom House begins to turn to the federal government for funding, you know, soon after its budget gets cut in half by the city government. And, you know, your story on Freedom House talks a lot about how Freedom House ran into opposition from sort of the political structure in Pittsburgh. So, you know, we have this question of what the reaction and response of local government officials and law enforcement was to Freedom House when its successes became more and more well known.
It's not positive in any way. You know, it's kind of interesting. Freedom House in many ways is the fountainhead for a lot of this information. You know, like any technical innovation, when Freedom House comes out, a lot of other things start to come very quickly. You know, there's sort of something in the ether and people are picking up on different ideas. Freedom House is being borrowed from bits and pieces or taken to other places. Other cities around the country that develop early paramedic systems have the full-throated support of their local government, regardless of how big or small those cities are. The only one that doesn't is a place where it was born. And the only difference between, say, Gainesville or Cleveland is that the service in Pittsburgh is entirely black, and everywhere else the service is entirely white. So, you know, it's pretty obvious what the problem that Freedom House faced. And it starts in 1970 with the election of a new mayor. He's not the only one by any means. There were people on the county level that resisted it as well. But, you know, the city either didn't enjoy being represented on such a national stage by its black community, or just refused to accept that its black community could have such an incredible and trend-setting idea. It's almost inexplicable why they would have resisted this, other than they didn't like the fact that the people doing it were black. You know, from day one, it is clear there is empirical evidence, there are studies done on how good these guys are, on how often they do the right thing with critical patients. So there's no doubt that what they're doing is the right thing. There's also no doubt that the city has the ability to pay for it. And there's no doubt that politically the city can make this program citywide. They make all those arguments. They try to say that Freedom House doesn't know what they're doing. They try to say that Freedom House is too expensive, which is patently false. They're paying significantly more for a police service that did almost nothing. And then they tried to say, well, we don't have the ability to expand this citywide, which again was also false. Their charter quite clearly allowed for them to run an EMS service. They had been running Freedom House at that point for several years, and they had been running the police service for decades. So, you know, and in fact, when somebody brings up some of these inconsistencies to the mayor in a very contentious city hall meeting, all he can do is laugh because he knows that there's no real justification for his statements. But the hurdles continue. At one point, they tell Freedom House, you guys cannot use your sirens downtown when you're running an emergency call. They don't tell that to the police. They don't tell that to the fire department. They only tell that to them. Again, they cut their budget from $100,000 to $50,000, which for a service that was already living hand to mouth and was out fundraising through national foundations, that was, you know, pretty close to a fatal cut. At that point, the city's spending more money on dog catching than they are on the Freedom House ambulance service. So, you know, the city resists them from day one and makes their life incredibly difficult from day one. And as we know, when the people at the very top normalize this sort of behavior, it trickles down to everybody else. And so, you know, the police department was never going to be a friend of Freedom House. On the one hand, they're quite literally stealing their jobs. I mean, let's be honest, like, the cops aren't doing a good job, but nonetheless, they were doing a job. And so the advent of a well-trained, a professional, well-equipped ambulance service on the scene is quite clearly going to, be the end of the cops' ambulance service. But add to that the guys doing this, the guys who are taking their jobs, are from a neighborhood that had previously, or had up until that time and after, was under the cops' boot heel, someone that they felt that they were better than or that they could control. You can imagine how that relationship was. And so, there's instance after instance in which they get on the scene and the police are also there. And so there's this Freedom House ambulance that's trying to treat a patient, and then there's this police wagon that's there who's just trying to grab the patient, toss him in the back, and drive away. Who has the power in that situation? It's always the police. And so even though Freedom House is trying to say, hey, slow down for a second, let us give this guy treatment, let us do some things so that we can try to save his life, the cops stand in their way and say, no, absolutely not, you need to go away. And one of the guys, John Moon, has a story of arriving at a car wreck, and it was this car that had smashed head on into a telephone pole. The driver was grievously injured. He was trying to get him out and stabilize his neck so that if he had a cervical fracture, which it turned out he did, that it would not get any worse. And the cop just went over, ripped open a door, and grabbed the guy and started dragging him out. John pleaded with him to stop, and the police officer spun on him and said, you need to shut your damn mouth before I take your ass to jail. So, that is the tenor of the relationship between these two services. It is incredibly, incredibly contentious. And there's almost no relief until the very end of Freedom House's tenure, where there's an instance of a child who's hit by a bus, and he's hit outside of Freedom House's service area, and the cop is there, and he's panicking, and he's yelling over the radio to send Freedom House. And the city dispatcher says, well, I can't, that's not in their service area, I can send somebody else. And he said, no, we need somebody out here, and who knows what the hell they're doing, send Freedom House. So, standing over a dying child, he knows where actual care is going to come from. And he knows in this moment, okay, I've got to let go of this ridiculous, hatred that I have and try to save this child's life. And the only way for me to do that is to bring Freedom House into the situation. And so, there is a recognition among the city's police officers that the only real care is coming from Freedom House. And ultimately, there's a recognition from city officials that the only care is coming from Freedom House, because they eventually start their own citywide system that looks very much like Freedom House's, and even, reach out to Nancy Caroline and say, hey, will you be our medical director? So, they knew what they had. They just didn't care for the way it looked.
One of the things that really draws us to the story of Freedom House is the fact that it shows that community-led and Black-led solutions to things like policing, injury, traffic accidents, and so on already exist, or that they can be sort of generated by the community, right? And it provides support for the fact that these sorts of solutions should be supported and fostered. In terms of our contemporary moment, down to the people who are drawn to it, with your experience as an EMS sort of paramedic, and the culture of EMS, the culture of paramedicine, the people that are drawn to paramedicine, how they are or are not supported in government. What sort of lessons do you think the story of Freedom House has? And there are multiple, right? Down to political opposition, trusting communities to come up with their own solutions, right, and so on. What are the sort of main lessons that you think that the story of Freedom House has for our contemporary moment, and for those of us that are interested in developing sort of non-police alternative responders to issues in our communities?
Freedom House is named after an organization whose goal was to provide job training opportunities for people living in the Hill. So when it was first conceived, even before it was going to be this medical revolution that it turned out to be, it was to be a way for people from the Hill District to have the sort of job that they could be proud of, because that was a very difficult thing to come across at that point. So they were recruiting very specifically from that neighborhood with this sort of dual goal. One was, we're going to give young men. It's the 60s, so it's not until the very end that women begin working on the ambulances. We're going to give young men a job they can be proud of. And two, we're going to give their neighbors something to see, to be proud of. And so watching, young guys delivering critical medical care was understood to be something that other people could look at and say, hey, look, that's someone who looks just like me, who I've seen, running up and down the street, hanging out with my friends. I've seen that guy, and look what he's doing, and he comes from here, and maybe I could do that, and what a wonderful thing that would be for me, as opposed to just seeing, people that are struggling and people who are hoping to get by but aren't sure how, which was essentially where, the Hill was in the mid-1960s. And so, it is, from its inception, of the community. And the reason that it is so quickly adopted and it is held so dearly is because it was of the community there. By 1968, by February of 1968, the Hill has been sucker punched so many times, it doesn't know which way is up. It had been this thriving neighborhood that was torn down and devastated and had become overcrowded. All the job opportunities were gone. Crime was on the rise. Hope was non-existent. And then, in the wake of Dr. King's assassination, you have this week-long uprising. And so, the only grocery store in the neighborhood is suddenly burned down and is gone. So this was a place that was really struggling to find something positive. And time and again, you hear accounts of people who were living through that moment who would say, I'd see those guys, and I can't tell you how good it made me feel to see those guys. So for starters, a service that serves a community, being from that community is, it's invaluable, and you can see it in this instance. It's incredibly invaluable. I would say also that, I think, I don't know what was going on in 1968. I don't know how those police officers felt about their life on an ambulance then. But I can tell you that responding to psychiatric calls, responding to calls with people on the street, people who were unhoused and probably did not have any real medical complaint. They were people who were stuck on the street, and so 911 had been called. Those are very difficult calls to handle because there's no great place to, we haven't figured out as a society what to do with those two groups of people. The absolute wrong tool for both of those jobs, however, is the police, and the police always seem to get called for that. And if you asked any of the police officers that responded alongside of me when I was going to these psych calls, or when I was going to pick up a guy who was, asleep on the side of the street, none of them wanted to be there. None of them thought, this is why I got into policing. However, on an ambulance, the only frustration we had was we didn't have a good place. There was not a good next step. But to us, that felt like, well, sure, that's what we're here for. There's a psychiatric emergency. Yeah, let's take them. Let's pick them up. We'll bring them to the psychiatric ER. That is the right tool for that job. Why, there were always police officers there. I guess because sometimes the situations become dangerous, but they certainly were not the right ones to be brought out to those, and so often they are. There are a lot of cases like that where, we have relied on what is a convenient solution. And emergency rooms are another one. There's a guy asleep on the street. You pick him up, you take him to the emergency room. What are they going to do with him? He might have something going on. Who knows? Maybe they can say, okay, well, let's refill your meds and let's do this or that and rehydrate you and send you on your way. But let's send you on your way, which means that an hour and a half later, he's in a hospital gown wandering down the street, and so somebody's going to call 911 again for him because we don't have a solution. That's another example of the wrong tool for the job. I think policing very often gets sucked into these things that it really should not be involved in, and oftentimes, it's the wrong job, perhaps the wrong temperament, depending on who the officer is, but the result is not what it ought to be, which is let's find a solution for this person who's, either having a psychiatric emergency or because they are homeless, they're sort of stuck in a situation. We got to find some place for them.
I think it's really interesting, that point about Freedom House starting off as a job training program that had two purposes, right? One, to provide job training, but also to provide sort of a model, right, for folks living in the community. Many alternative responder programs today, these teams, are kind of multifaceted, right? So in some places, it's a paramedics. You've sort of, for lack of a better word, a sort of traditional co-responder model, which has a mental health clinician maybe going out with a police officer. In some cases, you have two paramedics, but some street response teams include sort of a peer responder, right? Someone with lived experience, maybe with mental health issues, behavioral health issues, alongside a paramedic or a case manager and so on. I wonder, maybe in your capacity as sort of a paramedic and someone who's conducted this research on Freedom House, how important would you say it is that as municipalities throughout the country are experimenting with the new sort of alternative responder programs, how important is it for them to include or think about peer responders in their sort of models? Whether or not it's a response immediately to that 911 call, or in their sort of process of, providing that person with the services and the care that they require.
I think it's critical. An understanding of what the various challenges are is really kind of at the core of getting down to proper next steps, proper treatment, proper handling of the situation. I know that, as a new paramedic, you hit the street, it's sort of drilled into your head. You're basically a hammer in search of a nail, right? Like who's the person dying? Who's the person dying? And you get to these calls, and it's one after another, after another, after another, if you live in an urban area, of people who are not dying. And it can become incredibly frustrating. And, unfortunately, what you have to do in that situation is either learn yourself or be lucky enough to have someone experienced early on who says, well, hey, man, these are the 6 factors that led to this particular moment. And here's how you need to be, understanding, or at least how you need to approach it. You could bypass that period of learned knowledge by bringing in someone who understands the moment. I just recently read Tracy Kidder's book, Rough Sleepers, and to me, as intriguing as the doctors were, as the nurses were, listening to the patients who were in the system and had kind of gotten themselves in a position where they could now say, all right, let me help others, and listening to how they would instruct the doctors on, well, this guy went through this, and so, that's why he's in this position. Do you see where this guy went, and you see how this happened to her? Like that understanding, I realized, like, oh gosh, like how critical that must be if you're responding to people on the streets like that, to have someone who's in that situation, who knows what that feels like to be there and knows why they're there. I mean, that's an invaluable resource. And again, when the city took over for Freedom House in Pittsburgh in 1975, one of the biggest challenges that they had was they brought in a bunch of people from the suburbs who didn't understand life in these handful of neighborhoods in downtown Pittsburgh. And so, there was a lot of anxiety on their part. There was a lot of anger on their part. People would bring these big, 4 and 5 cell flashlights as sort of protection and bang on the doors and, come knocking very, aggressively, and everything was sort of like this battle mentality, because that's not where they were from, and they weren't used to this neighborhood. Everything felt scary and different and unknown, and there was just no way that those new paramedics were going to walk through the door and instantly know how to relate to the people that they were there to take care of, which is, EMS is the most intimate form of medicine. It is me and you kneeling on your living room floor with no technology between us. It's my instincts and a little bit of gear and whatever is about to take your life, and we need to figure out a way forward. We can't do that if we don't have understanding. And if the person coming through the door is an outsider who really doesn't get it and doesn't want to get it, it's just not going to work. And so, those sort of resources of having people with that lived experience, having people from a community, having people who really care, because I think a lot of providers in medicine at all levels get burned out and they get jaded and they get difficult. But you don't enter medicine because you're a jerk. With very few examples, I'm sure. You enter it because you care about people and you want to help people. It is not easy to be vomited on, and I've been vomited on so many times in my life. It doesn't bother me. Like, if you're sick and I'm there to help you and you throw up on me, hey man, we're in this together. Let's go. Let's keep going. that's in there for these people, and it gets covered up by the calluses of a very difficult job. And some of those calluses could probably be avoided if, when people entered into it, they were sort of, they were shepherded into this thing by people who really understood the patients, who understood the community, who understood all the dynamics and challenges. And if you take that model, which is a medicine model, and you expand it to, other problems that we're facing, then you could do the exact same thing,
Yeah, I think what really strikes me, or one of the many things that strike me about this story is the story of service, right? And so, I've said it before. I've been, I've attended conferences with police officers, police leaders, talking about problems that our society is facing, and they really do talk unironically about service. How do we serve, right? And for a fair number of them, there's this sort of mentality that I want to serve my community. I went through the Boy Scouts up to Life Scout, right? I understand to a certain degree what it means to be drawn to service and the satisfaction, right, of serving people. And I think you don't have to be paying attention, right, or lean one way or the other on the political spectrum to get a sense that this model of providing services through the police, through law enforcement, simply is not fit for purpose, right? And I think the story of Freedom House is really an inspiring story that you can be sitting unemployed in your community and have ideas for how to serve your community, and through support, right, through building with other people in your community, we can actualize these sort of solutions, right? And we can sort of manifest that desire to serve our communities, help other people, help them carry whatever burden, right, that they're shouldering alone, and really transform the institution of public health and public safety, right? Build something from the bottom up. And I think if you speak with folks in Durham, Denver, Seattle, right, many jurisdictions across the country, I think we have a lot of stories like this, and I think it's critical that we get the story of who initially came up with this idea, what they looked like, where they came from, out to these sort of jurisdictions, so that God forbid, they're not rejecting the very people who look like the folks from Freedom House in this iteration of thinking about public health and public safety and public service. So, I want to ask before we sort of wrap up, if there's anything else you'd like to add to this for podcast, anything that strikes you from the story, anything that you really want to sort of share to podcast listeners that we haven't touched on yet.
Well, I mean, you just kind of touched on what I think is such a key element to this. This service, which forever will change how lives are saved in America, was started by an immigrant, a Jewish woman, and a group of young black men. That's a medical revolution that was started by people that we don't often associate with high-tech medical advances. This was not, two guys in a bread truck just kind of winging it, just seeing what they could do. This was serious medicine. This was real work. This was real education that was very difficult to pass, that took place in the hospitals, that nobody else was doing, that drastically changed emergency medicine for the better and forever. And it was done by perhaps the least likely group. And the point of that, I would say, is, there are a lot of people out there who fall into one of those categories who are not presently in emergency medicine, who are not presently part of this conversation. Like, we need you, come and join us. This is, when I talk with John, who's a big part of the book and who I've traveled with and done speaking engagements with, that's always a huge thing for him. Is, this is where it began. We need all of you, all those people, who are represented by, the people who started this. You're out there, and you were of critical service then, and you will be of critical service now. So, come join us. You are part of this conversation.
Awesome. Well, I know I speak on behalf of everyone at TMI. I want to say thank you so much Kevin, both for the book and for joining us on this episode.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it.